This is a story about robbing Peter to pay Paul. When it comes to buying a first house, people around the world are looking for some way to pay uncomfortably high prices. Earlier this year, White House Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett suggested Americans might dip into their 401k retirement funds. But does finding new ways to borrow really help first-time homeowners? Or does it just drive prices even higher? We went to two countries with very different models to find out. Jordan Davies and Jeff Chia don't know each other. They've never met. But they have one thing in common. Both just bought their very first house. Davies, a lawyer in Melbourne, Chia, a sales worker in Singapore. And they followed very different paths to achieve their goal.
It's really hard when you see people who are doctors who worked so hard, studied for 10 years, and are trying to think about, well, I don't have a home yet, and I don't yet have a family, and putting off key decisions or key stages like having families because it's so unaffordable to get a home in Australia, in the big cities in Australia.
This is public housing from the HDB, our government. I bought it back in 2021 before it was built. At the point of time where we purchased this flat, we don't have to come up with a huge upfront of cash or money. All we need to get is probably a 5% of the down payment to secure the unit. And then 5 years later, where we collect our key, that's where we pay the remaining lump sum of 15%, amounting to 20% down payment for us. I would say it's not difficult to buy a first home in Singapore.
But Singapore might be the outlier. In the United States, the median age of first home buyers has risen from 33 in 2020 to 40 in 2025. And while the OECD's home price to income ratio has edged lower since its 2022 peak, it remains near record highs. Housing affordability is a key issue.
Every American who wants to own a home will be able to afford one.
So what can be done? President Trump has proposed extending the terms of mortgages from 30 to 50 years, lowering the monthly payments, but making homeowners pay more interest over a longer time. Another proposal from the White House to let buyers dip into their retirement funds is similar to a model found elsewhere around the world, including in Australia. Australia is among the countries where housing affordability is front and center, particularly in its biggest cities. Saul Eslake is the principal of Corinna Economic Advisory and was previously chief economist at ANZ and Bank of America in Australia.
The ratio of house prices across Australia to household disposable income per person aged 15 and over is now over 13 times. The median house price in Australia is a little over $1 million Australian dollars, or about 700,000 US dollars. That is more than 9 times average weekly earnings. You go back 30 years and house prices in Australia were about 4 times average weekly earnings. So housing affordability has deteriorated sharply, especially for younger Australians.
Australia has a mandatory 12% contribution to its 401k equivalent, and now lets people take up to $50,000 from voluntary contributions made on top of that to put towards a home. And there were proposals to allow even greater withdrawals.
At the last 2 elections, the right-of-centre parties in Australia, the Liberal and National parties, proposed to allow Australians to take up to 40% of their superannuation savings out to use in order to assist with the purchase of a home. My work showed, I think fairly clearly, that that scheme would have added upward pressure to housing prices, wouldn't have helped those in the traditional first home buyer demographic because they don't actually have a lot of superannuation saved up to that point, and would have lowered the amount of income they had in retirement, even after taking account of whatever savings in housing costs that might accrue to them by not having to rent through their working lives or in retirement. Now, as it happened, of course, the right-of-centre parties lost the last 2 elections, so they weren't in a position to implement that policy.
But Eslake says for all the policies governments throw at the problem, he's skeptical that they really want to fix it.
That Australian psyche has shifted from viewing housing as something that meets basic human needs for shelter and security and connection with the communities in which they live, towards regarding housing as a vehicle for accumulating wealth. And a much higher proportion, close to 2/3, of Australian household wealth is tied up in residential real estate than in almost any other country in the world. So I found myself saying in recent years that the reason why Australia's housing affordability problem will probably never be solved by any deliberate actions by government is because politicians know that a majority of Australians don't actually want the problem to be solved by housing becoming cheaper.
It's a different story in Singapore, where it appears to be a genuine priority to make sure that everyone can own their own home.
So the way Singapore thinks about is, it is the place to live.
Sumit Agarwal is the professor of economics and real estate at the National University of Singapore. He's not convinced that allowing access to retirement funds is such a bad idea.
So I think there are pros and cons of this. I mean, if you allow people to dip into their 401k to get into housing, not necessarily public housing in the US, but any kind of housing, on one hand, this could create inflation. Because now there is more money chasing same amount of housing, prices will naturally go up. The other aspect is we will provide democratized housing. There are certain people, they just don't have the right amount of money for down payment, and they are, as a result, renting and wasting their money. This will allow them to get into housing, consume housing, but also invest in the housing that will allow them to build long-term wealth.
Singapore's model is vastly different. It requires employers and employees to make mandatory contributions to what it calls the Central Provident Fund.
That retirement fund, they allow you to cash out some of it, especially if you're buying housing. So you can do it two ways. One is to cash out to make a down payment for your house, also for your making your monthly housing payments.
Around 75% of Singapore's population lives in public housing.
So typically what happens is, in most countries, when they decide to provide public housing, they segment it to lower income or minority neighborhoods. So those neighborhoods then become also very crime prone or risk prone. In Singapore, they make public housing for all around everybody. Public housing is all over the island, from the best neighborhoods to the fringe neighborhoods on the island.
Having public housing supply at the level of Singapore might not be replicable in other countries. But while Singapore makes it easier for people to get into their first home, it also makes it more difficult to buy a second.
In Singapore, there's something called an ABSD, or Additional Buyer Stamp Duty. What that means is that if you're buying a second house in Singapore, you have to pay an additional buyer stamp duty of 30%. Okay? That's upfront. So this discourages homeowners to become investors or buy second or third properties. Okay? This democratizes housing and availability, and also depresses pricing or doesn't grow house prices. Clearly, this is a great idea that, look, we don't want to discourage you from buying and investing in housing as an asset class, but we have to realize that housing is special. It's not just an investment, it's a consumption good.
If tapping into pools of capital like retirement funds just raises prices, and taking real steps to lower those prices hurts those who already own their homes, is there any hope of solving the housing affordability crisis?
The only way in which housing is going to get cheaper, I suspect, is if there is some kind of global financial upheaval that impacts the supply of credit, that in turn reduces people's capacity to pay what they currently pay for housing, and hence it becomes cheaper. But as I say, if that were to happen, there'd be enormous political pressure in this country on governments to do things to stop it happening.
So what does Jordan Davies think? He spent years saving for his first home in Melbourne. Now that he owns one, has his view changed?
I think I bought into this property with a view that that eventually property prices in Australia will need to equalise in one way or another. I bought this as a place that I knew that I'd be happy just living in at the cost that it costs, relative to what I might need to pay to rent in Melbourne. So I didn't go into the purchase thinking I want this asset to, significantly rise in value. I wouldn't like to see it plummet, that's for sure. So I'm of the same mindset as I was before.
And what about in Singapore, where the system favors buying one, but only one home?
I think there are two different groups of people in Singapore. In my point of view, I belong to the one that I want to buy a few more properties, be it residential or commercial, to build a portfolio.
As governments around the world take on the housing affordability crisis, the question may not be which levers to pull, but who is the Peter we're borrowing from to pay off which Paul?